convincing, although he might have an objection to a female Manny if you wait until we've already built the units. Well, there's a rumor, still unverified, I grinned at her. And they'd have to be really late generation. Original Bob had no uncertainties about his gender. She laughed. It would be pretty cool, though, to have another woman in here. Then she turned somber. I'll think about it and let you know, Bob. Sorry for the headache. I had never been to a moot quite this raucous. Officially, the subject under discussion was the Heavens River Expedition, planning for. In reality, Starfleet had come to the moot loaded for bear. They consistently torpedoed any attempt at discussion with points of order and derails of various kinds. Bill showed a lot more patience than I thought a Bob was capable of. I was sure I'd have lost it by now. They were actually wearing something that was close to but not quite TNG command uniforms. I guess they wanted to make the point without being out-and-out laughable. A lot of Bobs seemed to think they'd failed on that last bit, judging from the derisive comments. At the moment, a red-uniformed officer was spouting off. You don't know if they purposely decided on this life. That's the point. You're going in, you claim, to see if they're captives, but you'll do the damage before you know if it's necessary, assuming it's necessary. Starfleet paused to take a breath. Totally unnecessary in the bobbiverse, but a habit ingrained through 31 years as a human, and Bill took the opportunity to jump in. And you're assuming prima facie that we'll be doing damage. Of course you are, because you consider interacting with them to be damage. Then you point to the interaction as proof of the damage. Circular argument. No Cupid doll, sorry. We have a responsibility, argument by assertion, to keep from interfering in the affairs, prejudicial language, and you haven't proven the assertion yet. Starfleet gave Bill a murderous glare, and another red-suited member took up the attack. Look at your history. Deltans, others, even humanity. Every time you interact, you cause damage. Others? You're using the others as an example? Bill's expression of bristling disbelief was probably at least partly acting, but if there was ever a justification, this was it. The others weren't just sitting around minding their own business, you know, the damage they were doing. There's always a rationalization, isn't there? I stopped listening. Sadly, it was like most political arguments. No one was willing to debate their base assumptions or justify them or compromise on them. The simple tactic being that if you repeated your assertion often enough with enough emotion and volume, the opponents would somehow be forced to see things your way. Never worked, of course. At least it never had with Original Bob, but that didn't stop people from trying, even Bob's, apparently. I scanned the audience idly while waiting for Starfleet to get tired of beating their collective head against a brick wall, and was surprised to see two unfamiliar faces. I tried to check metadata, but I was blocked, so I sent a low-priority text to Bill. He responded during Starfleet's next tirade, evidently not listening any more than I was. Couple of replicants, clients of Eternity Solutions from Asgard. That was interesting. The people who chose a replicant afterlife were buying into strata-tidal virtual reality systems, computer systems orbiting in the Oort in their local system, rather than setting themselves up with a spaceship. From what I understood, you could purchase different packages which got you access to different levels of computer power, different VR options, and even access to Manny's for physical interfacing in real. They had access to BobNet as well, as did anyone, but mostly they'd kept to themselves. We had security policies set up, of course. They were guests in the computer sense of the word as well as the social sense, but Bill had an open-door policy regarding the moots. If anyone wanted to visit or even play some baseball, that was fine. The woman appeared bored. The man was trying to look in every direction at once, totally overwhelmed by the experience. It was obvious who had brought whom to the moot. They weren't making any waves with the Bobs either. Not like when Bridget or Henry first joined the moot. It must have become at least somewhat commonplace. I brought my attention back to the argument when the currently speaking Starfleet rep abruptly made a cutting-off gesture and said, "Enough! This is pointless. I can see you're not going to do the right thing on your own, so be it." He nodded to his group, and as one, they winked out. The moot erupted into pandemonium. More than before, I mean. That, I said to Bill in a low voice, was a veiled threat. "Yeah, but what exactly?" He frowned. "Well, maybe we can get this meeting done now, and you and I will have to discuss this later." Hugh was sending updates every 24 hours. For all that made the Skippies weird on paper, they were a lot more civilized and courteous than Starfleet, whom you'd think would be almost mainstream in the bobbiverse. Language and customs were coming along finally. We seemed to have crossed some kind of cusp where blocks of disparate information began coalescing into a more complete picture. We could actually go in with what we had at this point in an emergency. We'd just pretend to be from far away, and in Heaven's River, far away really meant something. The Borg had finished their android design based on the complete report on biology and had given me an auto-factory blueprint for one generic native Quinlan, male or female, with editable parameters suitable for producing distinct, individualized units. According to the notes, Quinlans differentiated each other primarily by facial shape and features, just like humans, plus some color variations in facial fur. The complete package included software and hardware support for generating unique faces. The notes also stressed that some field testing would be required before the design could be considered ready. It was funny. For all the divergence of the Bobs, give them a problem to solve and the differences disappeared. I would be very sad when I met a clone that lacked that quality. That would no longer be Robert Johansson in any sense that mattered. The exploration crew, including Will, was due for a meeting at 1600 to go over our status, so I was a little surprised to get a ping from Bridget 5 minutes early. I invited her over, and she popped in right away. "Hi, Bridget." I gestured to her favorite chair, and she dropped into it, looking uncharacteristically unsure of herself. "That thing we were talking about earlier?" she said, and waited for me to nod. "I'm not going to clone." I waited for Bridget to continue, but it looked like she was waiting for me to comment. "Okay. You've discussed it with Howard?" She nodded. "He's not happy. Mostly because I'm not happy. I mean, he's happy I won't be cloning, but I know what you mean. I have to be honest, Bridge, I don't entirely understand why you and Henry are so much against replication. I mean, I've never been what you call a fan, but we are heading for 10,000 Bobs by now. Many of whom don't self-identify as Bob clones anymore." Bridget waved off my incipient reply. "I know that's not relevant to your decision, but it is relevant to ours. Plus, your being a humanist helps. You don't see yourself as being any more or less Bob than original Bob or any of your clones. For someone with, a more metaphysical view of life, it's not that simple. The best I can describe it is that I feel like each of us, myself and my clone, would end up with half a soul." I opened my mouth to point out that technically, by her belief system, only original Bridget had the soul, but realized in time that that would be the exact opposite of reassuring. Maybe I was finally learning when to keep my cake hole shut. "And on a more personal basis," she continued, "the new Bridget would be cut off from Howard and from our children. I know I wouldn't be able to share them with her, and Howard told me flat out that he'd be completely weirded out by the idea. I try to imagine myself waking up and realizing that I'm the copy, that I'll never again be with Howard and the kids." Her lips quivered as she struggled to regain control. I waited quietly, giving her as much time as she needed. Finally, she said, "I couldn't do that to myself, or to other me. So I'm going to accept that I'll be working away from home for a while, and I'll make it up to them when I'm done." "Okay, Bridget. Either way, it's good to have you on the team." She flashed what Howard referred to as one of her nuclear smiles, and I felt my IQ drop. Fortunately, Bill and Garfield picked that moment to pop in. Hey, all, got the latest from Hugh. Bill waved a bound report at us as he threw himself into his chair. Garfield settled in with a little more dignity. I summoned Jeeves, who brought in coffee, little sandwiches without crusts, and a perpetually full and fizzy glass of Coke for Will when he showed up. Bill held up one of the sandwiches. You've served these a couple of times now. I like them, but where did the idea come from? I grabbed a sandwich and scrutinized it. Dunno. Random memory from original Bob, I guess. I'll probably get tired of them eventually, but you can put a lot of different things in sandwiches. Will popped in, waved, and flopped into his beanbag. Okay, ladies and germs, let's do this. Bill grinned at him and tossed the report into the air. It morphed into a video window, and Bill waggled a finger to pull up summaries and sub-windows. Androids are coming along. It'll be a good 6 months yet before they're ready, assuming they pass all functional tests. We're working with a lot of new techniques here, so I don't want to rush anything. Bill motioned to Garfield, who took up the thread. The gamers went through a ton of scenarios, but couldn't come up with anything tricky that would get 4 Quinlan-sized bodies through the airlock and past the boojums. So they've suggested we just bore through the outer shell, then work our way into the elevator system internally. That seems risky. What if the boojums notice? Well, the gamers suggested that the boojums can't be too hair-trigger about the outer shell. After all, even with the amount of in-system cleanup they've done, there will still be a certain number of micrometeor impacts every year. If they came running each time there was a tremor, they'd be doing nothing else. Good point. I cocked my head. Are we going to test it? I figure we'll just pick a point between 2 airlocks and start digging. If they come running, we either run away or self-destruct, then come up with another plan. Will grinned. Well, it does have the virtue of simplicity. Yeah, I rubbed my eyes. All right, let's give it a try. Gar, can you be in charge of implementation? Sure thing. Next order of business, I said. What do we do when we get in? Damned if I know, Bill answered. We have absolutely no indication that Bender is even in Heaven's River, let alone where he might be. This makes a needle in a haystack look like a sure thing. Except we don't really need to find Bender, Garfield interjected. Heads turned to him. All we need to do is establish contact with whoever has him. Or failing that, with whoever runs the ship, assuming they're not the same group. This isn't a blind search. It's more like detective work. True enough, we'll be working blind initially. I was silent for a moment as I went through the options. As we learn more, we can narrow things down a little, maybe get more of a sense of direction, metaphorically speaking. There were nods around the circle as each person worked through the implications. This was the open-ended aspect of the project. We had no idea how long it might take to narrow things down because we had very little idea what we were going to find. It's worth noting, Garfield said into the silence, that there aren't that many boojum airlocks. If you assume that Bender's matrix went in through one of them, it really narrows things down. True, there are, 9 entrances? Yes. And most of them appear to be inactive, which makes sense if they aren't doing anything beyond cleanup patrols. Could we send in multiple teams? Bridget asked. Bill shook his head. We talked about that. More teams would mean more delay and more likelihood of exposure. Once the Topopolis controllers discover our existence, they'd likely institute some kind of large-scale search and maybe take other defensive postures. Remember, we don't know that they'll be friendly. Our only contact with them so far has been them blowing up Bender and then Bob's drones. I don't want to take a chance on how they might react to an invading force. Keep it small. Don't look dangerous. He grinned at us. Having said that, if we run into a brick wall, there's always the option of sending more teams in. Bob can build some more matrices locally and do some cloning, if bandwidth starts to become an issue. But the Mannies take a lot of time to build, very finicky design. The spy drones will continue to spread out as well, Will added, in both directions, upstream and downstream. If they find anything unusual, we'll be alerted, and we can make a beeline for that location. We all exchanged looks. I guess we're on track, I said. Let's see how the tunneling works out, then we'll meet and discuss. 13. Swimming with the Fish. Howard, December 2333. Big Top, Epsilon Eridani, Poseidon, Eta Cassiopeia. Another beautiful day in Tantor. Hands behind my back, I gazed through the picture window at the layers of cloud outside the city dome. At our altitude in the atmosphere of the Jovian planet Big Top, I could see at least 50 miles of clouds above us, and anywhere up to 100 downward before the view faded into the mist. They renamed it Trantor after all your carping, Howard. You got your way. Stop being a sore winner. I could feel Bridget's glare boring holes in the back of my head. She was right, of course, but what was the point of being a curmudgeon if you couldn't curmudge? I turned and walked over behind her. I kissed the back of her head, and she leaned into me. This gave me an opportunity to examine the image on the canvas. More new quilt species? Bridget pointed to several items. Sure looks like it. I can't figure out the mechanism, but quilt biota can, and often do, spawn new species every few generations. I shelved this for 5 years, and I'm basically starting over from scratch. She swiped the canvas with an irritated motion, and the screen winked out of existence. If you go on this expedition with Bob, it could be another several years. You might never catch up. It wasn't quite an objection, but it wasn't supportive either. I still hadn't decided if I was for or against Bridget going. I know, Howard, but Quilt will still be there. This is a once-only opportunity. Did you contact Marcus? Yep, he's agreed to give us a tour. He'll be waiting at Moody Port. We should pop over in Vert first to say hi. Then let's do this. The Manny closet opened at my mental command, and we stepped into our individual pods. As the pods started to close, I took a quick glance at Bridget. Her resting face showed she was more concerned than she let on. I knew this decision would be hard. I also knew she'd agree to do it. There were few people as driven as my wife. I exited the Manny and popped over to Marcus's VR. A moment later, Bridget appeared. Marcus, sitting by a fireplace, waved to a couch. Coffee and snacks sat on a coffee table within easy reach. Marcus was using the standard Bob library VR at the moment, probably taking a rest from the Battlestar themes. He waited until we were comfortable and properly snacked, then said, So, I understand your inquiry has to do with the business that Bob 1 is involved with, but I haven't really been following it. Mind filling me in? We'll be going into the megastructure wearing manis that mimic the native sophonts. Bridget shifted and leaned forward, gesturing with her hands. That part isn't new. Bob 1 did it with the Deltans, and Howard and I have done it. We've even done non-humanoid manis, as with the Big Top native species. Bridget glanced sideways at me, and I grinned. Flying around in the gas giant's atmosphere as humongous manta rays was one of our first adventures as a replicant couple, and we still did it occasionally for fun. Bridget continued. The natives are generally humanoid, but they're also aquatic, and they're intelligent, and come from a technological society, although we're not sure of their current level of knowledge. From that point of view, it's a bit of an unknown. We were hoping you could give us some perspective on aquatic manis. Marcus nodded and looked thoughtful for a fraction of a mil. The Poseidon dolphins are intelligent animals, but as far as we can tell, they're animals, just like Terran dolphins were. There's a simple language, but it's at the level of danger, predator, and good food. There's no symbology or grammatical structure. It's only slightly more advanced than baboon calls, so I'm not sure where I come in. You've been living among them almost full-time for a couple of years, though, Bridget replied. How well are you accepted? How long did it take to fit in? And how hard is it to act like a dolphin? I get the impression they think I'm a little weird. Marcus shrugged and gave an embarrassed smile. But I'm not shunned. I've had to fend off some mating advances, so I'm not too weird, you know? Hasn't stopped me, I interjected. Bridget made a low growling sound as Marcus laughed. I think it sounds like you're concerned about fitting in without issue. That just requires doing your homework first. As for the aquatic end of things, Marcus shrugged. Well, let's find out. I have a couple of spare dolphin manis. Marcus messaged us a couple of addresses, then popped out. I followed immediately and found myself lying on my stomach on a platform in a dark room. Wait, no, it wasn't a dark room. It was underwater. I rolled my eyes upward as I examined my action inventory and saw that we were about 10 feet below the surface on the edge of what was probably one of the Poseidon plant mats. This would be Moody Port, formerly a major colony location on the West Indies mat. Nowadays, with everyone living in flying cities, it was strictly for agriculture and aquaculture. To my left, 2 other dolphin mannies were moving around. A quick ping identified Bridget furthest left and Marcus to her right. My heads-up help system indicated that the dolphins used a swim bladder to control buoyancy. I flexed and felt myself float up off the platform. A quick flick of the tail, and I was sliding forward through the water. Original Bob had never been much of a swimmer, preferring to keep water in bathtubs and, in extreme situations, hot tubs. But this was different. More like flying. The big difference seemed to be the complete lack of any concern about drowning. Of course, in a manny, breathing wasn't a problem anyway, but the Poseidon dolphins actually were fish, so they absorbed oxygen from the water using something like gills. Interestingly, they could also absorb oxygen from the air while floating at the surface by pumping air slowly through their swim bladder, so holding one's breath would never be an issue. It was kind of a best of both worlds thing. The resemblance to Earth dolphins was remarkable, though. The domed heads and beaked mouths could fool you into thinking you were dealing with Earth stock until you spotted the vertical tail flukes. Bridget shot past me, then glided to a gradual stop. She turned and repeated her actions. Marcus bumped me, then spoke over the universal intercom. She's very methodical, testing maneuvers one at a time. You have no idea. Hey, Bridget said, I'm swimming here. There's a pod that hangs around this area because of the spillover from some of the aquaculture. I figure we'll go join them for a while, and you can see what it's like to swim with the natives. Marcus swam off, clearly knowing where he was going. I glanced at Bridget, and we turned to follow. Over the next few minutes, Marcus gradually increased his pace. I had a brief bit of trouble at one point, sort of like when you change from a jog to a sprint, and I couldn't get the new rhythm, but by letting go and allowing the autonomous systems to take over, I was able to correct. After that, I kept up with Marcus with no effort. We're going just about flat out for a dolphin, he said. We'll have to slow down before we get to the pod, or they'll think we're running from something. We don't want to start a mobbing. That's not part of the autonomous systems, though, right? Bridget asked. Correct. There are some things you just have to learn through study, Marcus replied. How's you swimming? Fine, thanks. I feel a lot less concerned about that aspect of things. The Manny system seemed to be highly competent at mimicking natural reflexes. Marcus didn't reply, but he did an exuberant barrel roll. I did a barrel roll of my own, then found I'd overshot and had to complete a second one. Some things apparently did require practice. Marcus slowed down and began taking a more circular path. Probably we were getting close to the pod, and he didn't want to charge straight at them. Even at a lower speed, I could see that being a challenge. Within a minute, we slid up to a pod of the native version of dolphins. 15 individuals, including 3 juveniles, slowly swam through the water, nabbing small swimmers and scraps of plants or animals. They didn't appear to be very choosy. Presumably most things were edible in this world ocean. On the other hand, I used to own a dog that regularly ate dog poo, so who knew? The adults in the pod turned and began circling us, more in a curious than aggressive manner, fortunately. They were making noises, and my translator rendered them as, What? Who? Friends? Marcus friend. That last one was interesting. Apparently, their proto-language included tags for individuals, which the translator converted to Marcus's name. Marcus said, Friends, Marcus friend. That appeared to be enough. The pod did one more circuit, then went back to feeding. One of the juveniles came over, briefly bumped Bridget, then went back to his mother. That was cute, I said. Not so sure, Marcus replied. That one is approaching puberty. He might have been checking out your wife. That's it. He's sushi. Bridget laughed, did a quick barrel roll, then porpoised into the air. She came down with a splash. That seemed to trigger the entire group, and soon everyone was leaping and splashing. The game lasted about 10 minutes, after which we all floated on the surface for a short time, pumping air through our bladders. Then it was back to feeding. Not a bad life, I said. Might get a little boring after a while. The big predators mostly avoid the mats, Howard. We've made our feelings clear enough about their attempts to raid our farms, and they've gotten the message. If you want excitement, swim about a mile farther away from the mat. Krakens don't know the difference between a real dolphin and a manny, and I can tell you from experience that getting eaten is not fun. I'll give that a pass, thanks. There's a limit to what I'll do for research. I understand you have some kind of a training program going on? Bridget said, changing the subject. More of a selective breeding thing. Dolphins that have more facility with communications and comprehension get a fish treat. Better-fed dolphins have more and healthier offspring. See where I'm going? You're breeding them for intelligence. Marcus did another barrel roll. Uplifting by non-invasive means. I found myself simultaneously fascinated and a little shocked. Have you discussed this? Some. By and large, people don't see a problem. The dolphins aren't a threat or competition, and on balance, I think it would benefit them. And let's face it, Howard, Poseidon's citizenry doesn't have any tolerance for a central authority, given our history. No kidding. Marcus had been one of the key figures in the overthrow of the previous totalitarian government. What they had now was more like independent city-states. It seemed very ancient Greece, but it worked. Guys, the pod is acting funny. Marcus and I turned at Bridget's comment. The dolphins had become completely quiet, and in fact were barely moving their tails enough to stay in place. They also appeared to all be looking down. I rolled enough to be able to point an eye downward. Sliding slowly through the water below us was a leviathan. I remembered from my reading that they grew to about the size of a Boeing 747. This one seemed much bigger, but that might have just been me freaking out. Didn't you say they stayed away from the mats? On average, Marcus replied. This one seems to have developed some bad habits. I'll message perimeter security. Meanwhile, let's just emulate the dolphins and not attract its attention. There's a plan. Vaguely cuttlefish-shaped, the Leviathan had 4 tentacles that it used to grab prey from below or above the water. They'd taken out a significant number of humans in the first year on Poseidon before the colonists figured out how to keep them away. Perhaps this one was just passing through. It didn't vary its heading or speed and was soon lost in the watery distance. The dolphins started to swim around once again, although they remained more subdued than previously. That was fun, Bridget said. After another hour, Bridget announced she was satisfied. We squeaked goodbye to the pod and headed back to Moody Port. Docking the Mannies took only moments, and then we were back in Marcus's VR. Did you get what you needed? He asked. Yes, I think so, Bridget replied. I've noted some things that are important to allow for in our research, but generally speaking, I don't think the physical aspects of being aquatic are going to be an issue. If we can adapt to being dolphins, we can adapt to being oversized beavers. Are you going to be working with the dolphins over the long term? I said. Marcus nodded. I've kind of picked a vocation, I think. I've noticed that bobs in general seem to eventually gravitate towards some kind of endeavor and then stick with it, like the group trying to design and breed an intelligent airborne species on New Home. Wow, I hadn't heard of that one. I grinned and shook my head. Well, as long as someone doesn't get the idea of raising the elder gods or something. That would play hell with your humanism, wouldn't it? Bridget stood. Time to go. Thanks for your help, Marcus. Let's go, Lovecraft. 14. Council of War. Bob, April 2334, Vert. It was an even fuller house today. I had the leaders of the support team as well as the expeditionary members. Bill, Will, Garfield, Bridget, Gandalf, Hugh, and Locutus all sat according to individual preference, in lazy boys, beanbag chairs, or wingbacks. I'd given in and expanded the library floor space. It was a bit jarring to see everything just that little bit farther away. Things are going well, relatively, I said. No major hiccups at this point. Locutus held up a hand. I sighed. Something happened since I talked to you this morning? Manny construction in trouble? No, nothing that dramatic. Just something that occurred to me. We need to field test the Mannies, but there's no actual field where you are, if you get my drift. Oh, for God's sake, Garfield muttered. I grinned at him. Isn't it always the little things that bite you? I scanned the group. So, okay, the Steamborg have the Mannies ready, but we have no way to test them in a realistic environment. In the past, we've always had a planet for testing, and if something went wrong, we could just do a fix and re-release. In this case, once the androids are in country, we're stuck with them. We could use the Quinlan home planet, Garfield suggested. Absolutely not, Bridget replied. We don't know everything that went into the destruction of the home world. Can we call it Quinn? We all nodded, and she continued. The Quinlans had some kind of conflict or multiple conflicts that ended up killing off everything on the planet. Nukes and orbital bombardment are obvious because they leave evidence, but what if they used biological warfare as well? Imagine us picking something up on the Mannies and then transporting it to Heaven's River. By definition, it'd be virulent and hard to kill. Good point. Garfield sat back, embarrassed. Still, we can't afford to not test the Mannies, Bill said. Look, it's not quite as good, but we can at least test the design. We send 1 or 2 Mannies down to Quinn and just leave them there when we're done. It'll set our schedule back, having to fab a couple of replacements, but it'll be much faster with the second batch. And if we find an issue, we can fix all of them. Locutus sat forward, showing enthusiasm. We can send some maintenance equipment down with them, including a small printer, so we can perform any fixes on the planet-side Mannies as well. That way we're always testing the current version. We all looked at each other, smiling. It was an excellent solution, and as a bonus, it might settle some questions about Quinlan history. Good. I turned my attention to Gandalf. Now, how about gaining entry? Gandalf blew out his cheeks. Good news and bad news. Great, Garfield grumbled. The good news is we have a plan. The bad news is it will carry some risks, not only of getting caught, but also of getting ground to a pulp. Even more great, Garfield sat back and crossed his arms, looking aggrieved. We can't activate the spin transfer system. That's the bottom line. There's no way to do that without alerting the powers that be. It's just too tightly bound to internal control systems. That's not terribly surprising, Bill said. Do you have an alternative? Yeah, but you're not going to like it. I already don't like it. Gandalf flashed a quick smile. The collection bins in our mining drones are just big enough to fit 1 Quinlan Manny at a time. No way, Garfield interrupted. You cannot be serious. Sorry, but yes. We'll ferry the Mannies in the same way we ferried the spy drones in, except one at a time, like I said. Look at the bright side. You won't all be at risk at the same time. It decreases the chances of losing the entire expedition, while increasing the chances of losing 1 member, Garfield interrupted. I don't like it. No one does, Garfield. But we haven't come up with anything that isn't even riskier in one way or another. I assume that getting discovered by the Topopolis administration is a non-starter? Nods around the coffee table confirmed the statement. Then by definition, risk of equipment loss is less critical. So we examined a number of alternatives, and this is the least risky. What is the risk of damaging the Topopolis itself if we screw up? I asked. Negligible, Bill replied before Gandalf could. You have to think of the relative masses. If you're jogging and you run into a mosquito, how much damage do you take? I hate mosquitoes, as do we all, even out to 20th generation, Bill replied. I doubt that'll ever change, as mosquitoes have no redeeming features. But to my point, the drone and Manny would get slapped onto the inner surface of the outer shell hard enough to leave a crater, and not much else. That inner shell, though, is tough. It has to be. You've tested it? We originally reconstructed the material from scans. There's some truly ingenious layering involved. It's about 50% stronger pound for pound than our hull material, and that stuff is wicked strong. Bill nodded emphatically to reinforce his statement. Huh. Okay. I thought for a moment. Can we bring in a spare, Manny? Expedition needs to be 4, Bridget said. That's the most typical number for young Quinlans going on a sabbatical. Yeah, I'm not clear on that part, Will said. Sabbatical? It's not the right English word, but it's the closest we can come. Young Quinlans just around adulthood often leave their home city, usually in a group of 4 called a sabbat, to see the world and possibly find a new place to settle. They might start a new town, or they might just join an existing one. My guess is that the behavior evolved to keep the gene pool diverse. It's generally mostly males that do this, although females are common enough that no one would be surprised if one of the group is female. So no one will be curious about a female alone with 3 males? Bridget smirked at Garfield. Quinlan females are slightly larger than males and have the same teeth and claws, so unwelcome advances would not work out well. Anyway, their mating is seasonal, so it isn't even a question most of the time. Got it, but what about having a 5th Manny ready, just in case we trash one of the 4? Okay, Bob, Bridget shrugged. As Howard always says, you can't be too paranoid. Fine. Now, you. Language and culture. We've made progress, but no real revelations. Our level of language comprehension is good enough to not be suspicious. There's regional variability, and we haven't cataloged a lot of the colloquialisms sufficiently yet, but thanks to the sabbatical thing, it will probably even out. So you'll probably always be able to understand the locals. There are some things we haven't been able to get a handle on. Maybe you'll find out more on your travels. Gandalf was waving his hand. You had more? I asked. Yes, we won't go in through the cargo bay. We're going to dig a tunnel. Yeah, it's been discussed, and it seems reasonable given that Mannies are bigger than spy drones. Why do you bring it up? Well, we have to start now. So you'll need miners and roamers immediately. Yep. I shook my head. The to-do. It burns. 15. Functional testing. Bob, May 2334, Quinn. The cargo drone settled carefully onto the very dead lawn, or lawn like flora, anyway. Whatever the plant once was, it had been used by the Quinlans as a lawn equivalent. I glanced sideways at Bridget's Manny, an action made easy by the Quinlan form's very mobile and independently movable eyes. The resulting double image was hard for human minds to handle, but I was figuring out how to pay attention to one eye and ignore the other. It was something the Quinlans did easily and routinely, so it would probably be noticeable if the people in our group never did it. Like a human who never moved his eyes but only swiveled his head. Bridget turned and smiled at me as the cargo bay doors started to open. Actually, she performed a beak-rubbing motion, which was the Quinlan equivalent. As had been standard procedure since my days on Eden, the Manny operating system converted human expressions into native equivalents so that we never had to worry about the actual action. Language was handled in a similar manner, so we spoke and heard English, including colloquialisms. The OS also chose English name equivalents for local proper names and kept track of which substitutions were used. The cargo doors finished opening and we stepped out onto the surface of Quinn. Bridget did a slow and probably unnecessary 360, carefully examining the environment. No obvious damage in this area. Any deaths here would have had to be from less obvious methods, radiation possibly, or biological. I don't know if there will be anything to dissect. She glanced at the drone hovering by her shoulder, part scout, part beast of burden, part courier. It currently held her medical tools in its small hold. The city, for city it was, had been built on the shore of a large, slow-flowing river. Instead of a maze of streets, the metropolis was crisscrossed by canals. The infrastructure had been set up so that the river flow turned over the contents of the canals, but with a mild current. That also meant that a design based on right angles would be suboptimal. The actual shape was more like slightly rounded diamonds, with the long axis along the direction of flow. Even if nothing else had been different, it would have made for a more elegant, less utilitarian design than the typical Earth city. But in addition, the Quinlans seemed to enjoy embellishment for its own sake. Buildings were rarely just simple solid rectangles. We saw cantilevered terraces, elevated walkways between buildings, and even buildings with deliberately engineered gaps through their middles, like the dragon gates in some Hong Kong skyscrapers, although I doubted feng shui was involved. And the windows. Quinlans used both placement of windows and color tints to make the side of every building a piece of art, like giant stained glass murals. These people loved their art, I said in a hushed voice. That they did. We walked past one building, and I couldn't help but chuckle. The facade around the entrance had been sculpted into what might be some kind of fairy tale scene, unless they actually had a species of giant rodent with a mouth that big. I wasn't sure if I'd want to bring my children to see this montage. But then I reminded myself that people used to read Grimm's fairy tales to children. We walked along a path that ran beside a canal. We could see half-submerged boats and barges in several places. It was likely that the Quinlans used rivers like humans used roads. I wondered idly what rush hour must have been like. Would they use transit, or would it even be a concept if you could swim like an otter? The buildings we passed were multi-story, but not the high-rise monsters that many Earth cities contained. I didn't see anything over about 6 stories or so. Perhaps the Quinlans didn't like heights, or maybe they just didn't see the point. The most notable feature, though, was the amount of square footage set aside for green space. Every building had a terrace in front of it, and most canals had a treed path running along one side or the other. All brown and dead now, but it would have been beautiful before. We finally turned and headed back to the building on whose front lawn we'd landed. We'd picked it deliberately, after an aerial survey, as the most likely place to find governmental stuff. It had a certain look of officialdom that seemed to transcend species barriers. A combination of pompous self-importance combined with lack of artistic touch or any kind of individuality, perhaps. Or I might be overthinking it. Getting into the building wouldn't have been a problem in any case for android muscles or roamer plasma cutters, but fortunately the front doors weren't locked. We gazed around the large lobby and spotted a directory. Definitely governmental, I said, perusing the listing, while the heads-up popped up translations. Licenses, statistics, taxes, all the usual things that seem to infest civilizations everywhere. I'm most interested in finding corpses. Emergency management sounds like something that would be staffed right up until the end, 4th floor. Bridget pointed to a solid-looking door near the elevators. We checked the door, and sure enough, it was locked. If this is a set of stairs, I said, as it appears to be, oof! The door bent and sprung off its hinges as we gave a concerted push in unison. Android muscles, remember? To reveal stairs going up and down. Yep, and locked at ground level just as they would be on Earth, so we can assume a similar level of distrust in Quinlan society. We proceeded up 3 flights of stairs, the rise and run looking odd to me, but feeling perfectly natural when I went down on all 4s. Like the Pav, Quinlans seemed to prefer to be on their hind legs, but would go quadrupedal when traveling any distance. I couldn't shake the image of a fat river otter when watching the videos of them getting around. We reached the 4th floor and walked down the hall, examining doors and information plaques. The Manny OS didn't automatically translate written information, but our InVision heads-up display showed a pop-up translation when desired. We soon found the offices of emergency management. The door wasn't locked. Presumably there had been traffic in and out right up until the end. There was no working lighting, of course, but Quinlan eyes had a large effective range to allow for both above and below water operation. Our android eyes were even better and covered a larger portion of the visible and surrounding light spectrum. There, Bridget breathed and made her way between the desks. A single, dried husk of a corpse sat at a desk, head still cradled in its arms. as if the victim had simply fallen asleep at their desk and never woken up. I hoped it had been that peaceful. Bridget gestured to the drone, which had kept up with us all this time. It floated down to desk level, and the cargo door popped open. Bridget reached in and began removing items. You going to watch? I have to do this other thing over there, I said inanely and retreated with my dignity in tatters. I'd seen my share of violence and death on Eden, but somehow the clinical, measured experience of an autopsy added a whole new level of yuck. The Manny wouldn't throw up, but I still experienced the mental reaction of any human non-medical professional. I heard Bridget begin to mutter to herself, no doubt dictating notes. As it happened, I could make myself useful in the meantime. I examined the office, trying for an anthropologist's viewpoint. The desks were desk-like. How many ways are there to present a horizontal working surface? The chairs were more like backless bucket seats with a slot to accommodate the Quinlan butt and tail. Each desk sported something that had to be a phone system, including a handset. Physical buttons were absent. There was a black plate that had probably been a touchscreen. I started randomly opening drawers. Papers, writing implements, and desk accessories dominated. A couple of drawers contained what might be fossilized snacks. I turned off my olfactory sense, even though after all this time there was unlikely to be any residual odor. It struck me that the interior of this building was surprisingly dry. I'd watched the TV series Life After People when I was still alive, and the show made the point again and again that things would fall apart quickly once people were gone. But everything here seemed to be in pretty good condition. Was that better construction, or milder weather, or perhaps a complete absence of bugs, molds, fungi, and so on? I couldn't use Mario's survey of the first others victim species he'd discovered for comparison because the others had taken the time to knock most structures down and procure the rebar and other metal components. I tapped on one of the windows. It wasn't glass. Possibly transparent aluminum or something similar, but that would be one reason for the lack of deterioration. Popped and shattered glass windows were one of the first ways in for rampant nature. I carried on with my wanderings as Bridget's voice continued to record her findings. It brought back my ongoing argument with Bill about how aliens would think and behave. Granted, an energy being or silicon entity would have a different outlook on life, but a land animal with the concept of individuality could only do things so many different ways. Desks were flat surfaces for working. Phones were devices for communicating with others at a distance. Doors separated spaces. Lights lit spaces. People, or whatever, needed a place to eat and a place to eliminate waste. I snickered. Maybe a race based on horses would have a different take on that last item. Or cows. I glanced down looking for cow pies or the equivalent. Nope. Bob? Done? Came Bridget's call. I hurried back to where I'd left her to find her packing up her equipment. On the desk was... I looked away quickly. Best not. I made a mental note to only peruse the text of her final report. She saw my reaction and gave me a quick smile, as quickly gone. There weren't any surprises in the autopsy. Our deep SUDAR scans really did catch pretty much everything important about the Heavens River inhabitants. I found the remains of a large viral load in the tissues, though. I've taken detailed scans and forwarded them to the Skippies. They tell me they can run a simulation if we get enough cellular and DNA detail. It'll tell us what we have. How long? Day or two, they say. Great. Meanwhile, we found a good place to park the cargo drone when no one is running these androids, unless you have some more spots you want to check out. Bridget shook her head. Nah. Most of our surveys can be visual in SUDAR. The Skippies are running drones in a search pattern of their own design. They intend to eventually map the entire planet's infrastructure in detail and put up a virtual globe. Huh, they think big. But it's all intellectual exercises. They are deliberately avoiding anything that involves contact with biologicals, or even, to a lesser extent, Bobs. I had a talk with Hugh. while we were agreeing on details for analyzing the results of this outing. He's a nice guy. Not a jerk in any way, but kind of, I don't know, disinterested or distracted. As if we're keeping him from his video games, but he's too polite to point it out. I nodded and sighed. Yeah, Bridge, you're not the first person to say that. We are living in an increasingly non-Bob universe. A text came in from Bill. You'll want to test the mayonnaise in water as well. Ah, fair enough. The envelope indicated it had gone to Bridget as well. She made a vague, out there gesture. Shall we take a dip in the canal? We looked down at the water. Given what I'd seen of the rest of the city, I was sure it would have been kept clean before. Now it had an oily surface sheen and far too much flotsam, although no actual trash. Still, it would do for testing, and it wasn't like we could actually catch something. I grinned at Bridget, called "Last one in," and dove into the water. I heard a splash behind me. There was a flicker as nictitating membranes covered my eyes, adjusting for the different refractive index. My vision was surprisingly good considering the state of the water. And the freedom. The Manning OS took care of the movement and reflexes, and I found myself swimming like an otter, curling and undulating through the water. A shape shot past me and slapped me on the head. I realized that Bridget had just laid down a challenge. I accelerated after her, and she did a right-angle turn heading straight down. She whipped around a submerged boat and pulled an abrupt reverse, speeding by me in the opposite direction. Nice try, but no cigar. I just barely caught her tail with my front paw, but it was enough for tag. She turned and took up the chase. We surfaced several times for air, even though the Mannies didn't really need it. The androids were designed to mimic the real thing, and that included an internal calculator to track when we should be running out of oxygen. We could ignore it, but in Quinlan company, that would likely attract unwelcome attention. Finally, Bridget shot out of the water and landed on her feet several yards from the edge of the canal, in a perfect penguin exit. I followed, staggering slightly as I landed. "Bob doesn't quite stick the landing," she exclaimed. "The judges deduct half a point." "Half a point? I was robbed," I responded, laughing. We both sat down at the same time, curling ourselves on the dead, non-grass. "That was awesome," Bridget said. "It's almost like flying. Better in some ways, and I know flying." "True, you've done enough of it. I think you hold the record for most species emulated, don't you?" She smiled at me. "I think Howard might actually have me by a couple. I'll have to check. But anyway, this will be my first aquatic effort. Serious long-term one, I mean. The test with the dolphins on Poseidon was, She glared at me, knowing what was coming, and I said, deadpan, "Dry run." "I so hate that I see those coming now." She started to lick her fur, then stopped with a jerk. "Oh, God, that's gross." "Part of the Quinlan persona, Bridget," I said, resisting the urge to groom myself as well. "Maybe we'll turn that off for now and just let the maintenance roamers clean us off." "Works for me." She glanced up as the cargo drone descended from the sky. It settled to the ground and we climbed in. I placed myself on the rack beside her. "Okay then, let's park this baby and go home." Bill flipped through the video window. "Looks pretty good. A couple of glitchy items, but those are all software. I'd say the androids are good to go." He tapped the window. "Only one other concern, and that's how the androids will handle vacuum. The new circulatory system might be subject to boiling under low pressure, or worse, rupture." "No problem," Bridget said. "Simple to test. Take one upstairs and open the cargo door. Contamination isn't an issue in that scenario." "Good enough." Bill turned to Garfield. "Can you take care of that?"
"Yes, master,"
Bill snorted. "We can call in some Skippy help if you prefer, or your gamer buddies." "No, it's okay. It gives me a chance to use the android anyway." "On that subject," Bridget interjected, "Will, if you want to practice using the androids on Quinn, there's lots of planet to explore, and I'm sure lots to learn yet." Will visibly brightened. "Hey, great idea. I can do that." "And go for a swim. It's unbelievable," I added. "Are we good on the sociology front?" Bridget asked. The Skippies say they've extracted as much as they can from the current data set. They're spreading out as the spy drones move farther afield, but diminishing returns is probably rearing its ugly head. There's not much more to learn from simple observation. Bill closed the window. The gamers have the entrance tunnel all dug, and they've widened the hatch from the foyer to accommodate the Mannies. There's no indication that we've been detected so far. Think about it, Will said. 1 billion miles of megastructure? How many cameras would you have to be monitoring to cover everything? And they've got mechanical sensors on equipment to detect most issues, so why bother? As long as we don't break something or turn something on, we're golden. Don't break something, I smiled. An excellent motto for any age. Do we have anything else outstanding besides Garfield's vacuum test? Not really, Will. As soon as that's done, we're ready to start building the production models. Anyone want to make a speech? We hate speeches, said Garfield. Well, okay then. 16. Human Replicant Reserve. Will, May 2334. Vert, Vulcan Post-Life Arcology. I was outside the virtual door of one Professor Stephen Gilligan, a former department chair at the University of Landing on Vulcan, with a list of letters after his name that could choke a horse. Professor Gilligan had been an expert in many things when he was alive, but of most importance to myself and Bob was that he specialized in artificial environments. Of even more interest to me personally was the fact that he continued to lecture at the university, although as a guest lecturer these days, and he did so in a Manny custom-made for him. So it wasn't just us Bobs anymore. I'd done some research at Bob's request, and the professor's name came up a lot. I had finally received an invitation to visit at the Vulcan Post-Life Arcology. The Arcology was physically located in a large space station orbiting Omicron Squared Eridani, just inside the Oort cloud. It currently had a membership of about 200, mostly rich and famous people who hadn't felt like waiting for medicine to catch up with them. I found myself unexpectedly unsettled. I'd been living in real, in a Manny, for so long that Vert had become a foreign experience. At the same time, I'd been away from human society for so long that I was noticeably behind the times. I resolved to give the situation a good think when I had some time. The door opened, and Professor Gilligan beamed at me. He was short, balding, and slight of build, which surprised me, since in Vert he could look like anything he wanted. "Ah, Mr. Riker, or is it Johansson? Come in, please," I replied with a small laugh. I run into that a lot, Professor. As the only Bob to take a last name as my moniker, I kind of broke the conventions. These days I answer to either, or just Will. "And you can call me Stephen. Please, have a seat." He waved to his living room area, which featured a large picture window in which floated the image of a ring-shaped habitat. As with most personal VRs, the setting was comfortable and spacious, but not ostentatious. Fancy layouts and gilding lost their impact when they were free but for the wave of a hand. I motioned to the view as I said, "Ring world?" "That is a bishop ring, actually. This image is intended to be 2,000 miles in diameter and 100 miles across. More than 600,000 square miles of prime real estate." "Still theoretical, though," Stephen replied with a shrug. "Of course. Technically, it's just an engineering problem, but the real roadblocks have always been economic and political. When you're settling a new system, you have to choose to either sit in your ship for however many decades it takes to build the megastructure, or choose to populate the habitable planet, essentially, immediately. The latter option always wins. And it's not really just an engineering problem, is it?" I said. "It is, in that we have all the technology required to build one, just not the knowledge. For instance, no one has ever been able to keep a closed ecology going for more than a year, at least on research scales. And having your ecosystem collapse on a megastructure would be," I grinned at him, "suboptimal." Stephen laughed. "Keeping an ecosystem going would not be a trivial task. You can't have actual bedrock or a water table, or even very deep soil, at least not without major engineering challenges, so You'd have to pump water up to stream heads, and you'd have to be constantly transporting topsoil uphill to replace whatever gets washed downstream. Trees would have to be shallow-rooted. Burrowing and cave-dwelling animals would be at a disadvantage. It's essentially like a zoo